The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3076, the Postal Service Reform Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3076 to provide stability to and enhance the service of the United States Postal Service and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3076.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the amendment. The bill has been years in the making, and I am proud to say that it is now bipartisan. I want to thank Ranking Member Comer and his staff for working diligently with me and others to put together this bipartisan bill to help ensure the Postal Service can continue to operate for years to come. Mr. Comer is a very tough negotiator, but he shares my desire to protect and improve the Postal Service. So after many, many weeks of discussions, we were able to come to a bipartisan agreement. I would also like to thank Representatives Connolly, Lynch, and Lawrence for their partnership and dedication to getting this bill done. I could not have done this without their support, their wisdom, and their insight. Finally, I would like to thank Congresswoman Foxx, who has not only agreed to co-sponsor this bill, but will also be serving with me as co-chair of the new Postal Caucus we are forming to strengthen the Post Office and Postal Service more. I would like to thank the staff on both sides of the aisle for their hard work on this important bill, particularly our Legislative Director, Mark Stevenson. The Postal Service is one of our nation's most vital and respected institutions. It binds our nation together in a way that no other agency or organization does. And this bill will put this vital institution on a sustainable financial footing for generations to come. And we need to remember that during the COVID pandemic, essential postal workers were on the front lines and were the literal lifeline for many Americans, so they deserve this help. In March, we held a hearing on a discussion draft of this important reform legislation. While the bill has changed to include other reforms since then, the foundational elements of the bill we discussed in March remain. First, the bill will require postal employees to enroll in Medicare when they are eligible. All postal employees already pay into Medicare, but many would not receiving it through their careers, but not all retirees enroll when they reach 65. Now they will be able to have Medicare coverage, and once it expires, our exhausted postal benefit plan will provide additional coverage. In addition, the Postal Service has already paid into Medicare roughly $35 billion since 1983. So it's only fair that their workers should benefit from their own money. The bill would ensure the Postal Service employees can fully utilize the benefits that they have already paid for. In fact, retirees who are already over 65 would be given a 3-month period to enroll with no penalty. This change does not cost American taxpayers a dime. Secondly, the bill would eliminate the unfair requirement that Postal Service pre-fund its retiree health benefits for 75 years into the future. No private company or federal agency is required to comply with such a burdensome and unfair pre-funding requirement. Instead of requiring the Postal Service to pre-fund retiree health benefits for all current employees and retirees, the bill would require the Postal Service to pay a small yearly top-up payment to cover the actual costs incurred by retirees in that year. This change will help reduce the burden on the retiree health benefit fund and help it remain solvent further into the future. These two reforms alone would save the Postal Service about $46 billion over 10 years. In addition to these foundational reforms, this bill would provide Congress and the American people with additional transparency by requiring the Postal Service to develop an online public-facing database that shows weekly service performance information, a great idea offered by Ranking Member Comer. This will help Congress and the public react to future poor performance quickly and efficiently. While I recognize that as this bill moves forward, there will be the need for additional technical adjustments to ensure that Postal Service employees' benefits are protected, the bipartisan reforms included in this bill will increase transparency, improve service, and put the Postal Service on a more sustainable footing for generations to come. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this important bill, and I yield back. And with that, I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer. Thank you, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And before I begin my remarks, I think that this process proves that this committee can work together in a bipartisan way, and that Congress can come together on bills that are necessary for the public. And when you talk about the post office, this is a service that just about every American has come to depend and rely upon, and it's something that the American people expect to continue. The health and efficiency of the U.S. Postal Service is one of the most important areas this committee is responsible for overseeing. Americans around the country, whether rural or in cities, rely on the Postal Service for their mail, bills, packages, medicine, newspapers, and many other areas of their lives. Ensuring the continuation and success of the Postal Service is not a responsibility anyone on this committee can take lightly. And coming up with solutions to the problems that face the Postal Service requires us to set aside politics and get the job done right for the American people. I believe today's bill, a bipartisan, realistic bill with a good chance of becoming law, fits that description of doing work for the people in this country. Now, to be clear, it's not a bill that gives everyone everything they want. Republicans, for example, have serious reservations about eliminating pre-funding requirements for huge liabilities created by the Postal Service and shifting Postal Service retirees to Medicare, a program which itself is in need of reform. But the status quo for the Postal Service is currently unsustainable. For over a decade, the Postal Service has been unable to even pay into the fund that required pre-funding to begin with. Let me repeat that. For over a decade, the Postal Service has not even paid in to this fund because they haven't had the funds to pay it. And as DeJoy has said, and his predecessor said, they're not going to pay into it because they don't have the money to pay into it, because the post office is on an unsustainable path. Republican and Democratic postmasters general have repeatedly said and proven that the Postal Service cannot afford to exist with the financial burdens placed on it by law. And after months of talking with Postmaster DeJoy, the Board of Governors, postal unions, the Inspector General, and industry, I believe that is true. But eliminating pre-funding requirements and shifting Postal Service retirees to Medicare will not fix the Postal Service. Wiping the Postal Service's balance sheet clean does not get to the root of what caused these liabilities any more than a rich uncle paying an irresponsible nephew's credit card bill fixes the underlying problem of a person who won't live within its means. If we simply passed a bill that cleaned up the Postal Service's balance sheet, that would just kick the can down the road for another Congress to have to deal with this problem. The Postal Service is meant to be a self-funded agency that does not rely on taxpayers' money. It is required by law to be self-sufficient and to operate on the revenue it brings in. The Postal Service's problem is simple. It's spending more money than it's making. Revenue for the Postal Service must increase and costs must decrease if the Postal Service is to survive as it's currently intended. And it must do so as people are sending almost half the amount of mail they were sending 20 years ago. From the outset of negotiating this bill, Republicans have been clear. We will only support a postal reform bill if it addresses operational and fundamental issues that are creating these problems. The bill today is a compromise. Republicans will support remedying the present financial condition of the Postal Office in return for a future in which Congress doesn't have to give it a bailout. And I believe we've struck a good deal for everyone and ushers in a new era for the Postal Service based on reliability, transparency, and affordability. Republicans have secured in this bill a new, transparent way for anyone from their laptop or phone to see if the Postal Service is meeting its delivery standards by zip code. In this bill, Republicans have ensured rural Americans continue to have access to their local newspapers and not be forced to pick up a national paper because the local newspaper went bankrupt. Republicans have secured in this bill a transportation network that is efficient, reliable, and cost-effective to ensure rates remain as low as possible and mail is delivered on time. We've also fought for and received assurance that the cost of magazines and catalogs, which Americans continue to enjoy, remains low and cannot be increased dramatically to make up for diminishing first-class mail. Another Republican provision establishes reporting requirements for the Postal Service. It's one thing for the Postmaster General to release a plan, but Republicans demand that the Postal Service follow through and inform Congress of that plan's implementation. Republicans have secured in this bill a cost accounting analysis that requires the Postal Service to attribute to its market-dominant and competitive products the cost and benefit of each. The Postal Service needs to know exactly what it costs to deliver every different type of package or mail piece that it has, and currently they cannot determine that. In short, the bill before this committee today is a significant and comprehensive approach to fixing the Postal Service, which has not had a significant bill pass Congress in 15 years. There are some on the other side of the aisle who may believe this bill does not go far enough, that what the Postal Service needs is some sort of vast reworking, such as by getting into banking or something like that. But I don't believe that's what the American people want. I believe the American people are pretty happy with the Postal Service. They know and just want it to run on time and for a reasonable price when they go to the post office. And banking at the post office, I'll just say, is a bridge too far for Republicans and a solution in need of a problem with the arrival of online banking and other services. The Postal Service needs to focus on what it does best, and that's deliver the mail. And I know that won't make everyone happy, but that's the nature of compromise. This bill presents a rare opportunity for this committee to come together and work for the American people, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And let me begin by congratulating you on this extraordinary accomplishment to bring us together. And I want to congratulate my friend Mr. Comer from Kentucky for his willingness and that of the minority staff to compromise, to try to find common ground on a problem that has vexed us since the so-called reform legislation of 2006. I think this is a signal moment. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor and was privileged to work with you in trying to put this together, but it's certainly a signal accomplishment of yours, Madam Chairwoman and Mr. Ranking Member, and you deserve a lot of credit. The mission of the Postal Service is to provide the nation with reliable, affordable, universal mail service. This mission has never been more critical than during this pandemic, as the Postal Service serves as a vital lifeline to communities across the country, delivering mail, critical medical supplies, food goods, and prescription medicines. Despite the Postal Service's central role, its very existence is in peril. Its financial condition has steadily declined for more than a decade, earning it a place in the Government Accountability Office high-risk list since 2009. Reductions in mail volume and other financial challenges, some created by Congress itself, have brought the Postal Service to an untenable position where expenses consistently outpace revenue. Meanwhile, the cost of sending mail is rising while service standards fall. In my district, for example, just across the river, the timeliness of first-class mail two-day delivery was 11.2% below the Postal Service's own delivery target at the end of 2020. For 3- to 5-day delivery, it was 22.3% below its own target. We can't let standards slip while prices increase. It's the prescription for a death spiral. With the Postal Service Reform Act before us today, we'll place the Postal Service back on firm financial ground. The PSRA would boost the Postal Service's financial outlook and drive cost savings through a handful of key provisions. PSRA would require postal employees to enroll in Medicare when they're eligible, which is in line with private sector practice and could save approximately $36 billion over a 10-year period. Additionally, the bill would eliminate an ill-conceived congressional mandate from 2006 lame duck session that required the Postal Service to pre-fund retiree health benefits at an exorbitant 100%. Since the enactment of that requirement, the Postal Service has posted net revenue losses each year, ranging from $2.7 billion to $15.9 billion. Unable to make its statutorily required payments, by the way, unique to the Postal Service, required by Congress, and only on the Postal Service, the Postal Service racked up $35 billion in unfunded retiree health benefit liabilities. Congress would fix this problem, a problem we created, by removing the pre-funding requirement and eliminating the $35 billion in health fund liabilities. It's a step long overdue. Also of critical importance, the bill would codify that the Postal Service offer 6-day delivery of mail and package delivery, integrating the network for all products. I champion that 6-day requirement in the House each year through requirements in annual appropriations bills, and I've been the sponsor of H.Res. 114, which has a majority of the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, supporting it every year. I've added 2 additional provisions to this bill, and I thank the Chair and Ranking Member for accepting them. One bolsters the long-term financial stability of the Postal Service and takes advantage of its vast nationwide footprint by allowing the agency to enter into agreements with state, local, and tribal governments to provide non-commercial properties and services like hunting, fishing, and boating licenses. The second provision streamlines oversight by merging the Postal Service and Postal Regulatory Commission Inspectors General into a single potent IG for the entire Postal Service. This bill would capture several important provisions that were not included in the PSRA originally. It would help the Postal Service more efficiently and effectively manage mail-in ballots in federal elections by requiring mail-in ballots to include a Postal Service trackable barcode and other stylistic attributes to make ballots easier to sort and track. And it would also expand access to paid parental leave for all Postal Service employees. I plan to offer 3 additional provisions as amendments to the second bill, and I'll describe those later. But again, congratulations. This is a signal event. I hope we can have strong bipartisan support coming out of the committee, and I hope we can get it onto the floor of the House and pass it and persuade our friends in the other body to do the same. Again, congratulations, Madam Chairwoman and Mr. Ranking Member. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Foxx, Virginia Foxx from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I want to thank you and Ranking Member Comer for the great work that you have done to get us to this position. with this piece of legislation. Few bills that pass Congress are perfect or make everyone happy, and that's so with this bill. But I share the comments that have already been made that this bill is moving us in the right direction, and it's a good start. We're here today to address the financial and operational shortcomings of the Postal Service. The Postal Service is projected to lose $160 billion over the next 10 years as mail volume decreases and costs continue to increase. I have to say I'm a big supporter of using mail. I have been all my life, and I will continue to do so, but I want to see changes made. It's long been a Republican objective for the Postal Service to produce a 10-year reform plan. Finally, in March, Postmaster General DeJoy released a plan to return the Postal Service to a more sustainable path. That plan called for legislative changes, which are included in the Postal Service Reform Act. This bill provides additional transparency mechanisms to help hold the Postal Service accountable for meeting goals and ultimately lead its management to operate more efficiently. Transparency is extremely important. Setting goals and meeting them is important. It also allows the Postal Service to choose the most economical form of transportation rather than using outdated rules that are not tailored to the modern needs of the Postal Service. Common ground is often elusive, and this committee has spent many years searching for it, particularly in regard to the Postal Service. I'm proud to say that the Postal Service Reform Act, while not perfect by any means, but the act before the committee today is a step in the right direction to help the Postal Service fulfill its mission for years to come. And with that, I thank all the staff and the members for working on this, and I yield back.
The lady yields back. I now recognize Representative Lawrence, who's been a vital partner in making this happen. Brenda Lawrence, are you here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, great. I wanted to start off by saying how excited I am about today. As many of you know, we have been working on this for many years. I want to thank Chairman Maloney, I want to thank Chairman Connolly and Chairman Lynch for your collective dedication in preserving and strengthening the Postal Service. I'm thrilled to be in support of a bipartisan Postal Reform Act because the service of the Postal Service touches every human household in America on 6 days a week. After putting my time and investment in a career in the Postal Service for 30 years, I understand the critical role the agency plays for all of our constituents across the country. Make no mistake about it. It's imperative that we pass this legislation. I'm honored that I am now in a position to continue to fight for more than 600,000 dedicated postal employees as a member of this committee. It was also a pleasure and a privilege to have shaped the policies included in this legislation. The importance of eliminating the pre-funding mandate and integrating the workforce are both critical to the Postal Service long-term standing, but I also want to highlight a few of the provisions included in this bipartisan bill. First, I want to praise the inclusion of the provision to provide the Postal Service with the flexibility to preserve non-postal related revenues. As fixtures of municipalities across the country, we should empower the Postal Service to provide postal services that Americans need. Also want to commend the language requiring the Postal Service to maintain an online publicly available dashboard to track service performance. For years, for part of the last year, communities in my district have experienced non-existence of sporadic mail delivery, leading to undelivered prescriptions, stimulus checks, and more. By requiring the Postal Service to post this information publicly, we ensure that the agency is held accountable for maintaining its service standards. If we do not make every effort to affirm the Postal Service commitment to its performance, it may chip away at the foundation of what makes this agency so great. And I should add, the most popular in the federal government. That was something when I was in the Postal Service and served as a letter carrier, I felt personally the honor and the pride of touching so many Americans every day. And they counted on me. Before closing, and as our country continues to overcome COVID-19 pandemic, I want to again recognize the Postal Service employees have reported to work each and every day to ensure parcels and packages reach their intended destinations. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the thousands of postal employees who contracted COVID and the tragic death of employees who passed away from the complications. Few people recognize until this pandemic that Postal Service workers are frontline workers. The dedication and commitment to upholding the Postal Service mission by the entire workforce is a testament to the employees who deliver mail in our communities every day. I urge my colleagues to preserve this bipartisan agreement and provide the Postal Service with the reforms it needs to continue serving the American people for decades to come. It has, just as it has been for the last 2 centuries. 2 centuries. Thank you again, Madam Chair, and I urge everyone to support this bill, and I yield back.
Who seeks recognition? Does anyone else seek recognition? Well, the question now.
Madam Chair,
Yes. Mr. Higgins, you are now
Madam-
recognized.
Madam Chair, just for a moment, let me say that I'm a supporter of the post office, always have been, as part of American culture and history. And I think that Mr. DeJoy is perhaps the greatest hope that we have. I believe he's determined to get the job done, and I appreciate the work that's been done on this bill. I'm going to support it, but I have great reservations as to whether or not it's going to be successful. I do believe as Congress moves forward and we measure the success of this bill, which I'm prayerful for, we're going to have to continue to revisit additional reforms. So thank you for the work that's been done. I recognize it as a bipartisan effort. I am going to support the bill, and we'll see what happens. And let's continue to support Mr. DeJoy as well.
Madam Chairman,
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Davis.
thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm a strong supporter of HR 3076, and I want to really commend you and the ranking member for being able to reach an agreement that is bipartisan, that maintains the core concepts of 6-day delivery, that gets rid of the prepayment. It's an outstanding piece of work that both of you have done, and I am delighted that we have an opportunity to correct some situations that have existed and have been a long time coming. So congratulations to you again and to the ranking member, and I yield back.
Madam Chairman,
Thank you. Mr. Keller, is that you seeking?
Mr. Keller is here, yes.
Okay, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the ranking member. I realize this is a piece of legislation that is considered to be bipartisan, and everybody has been speaking in support of it. While I have reservations about it, it's also, what I understand, endorsed by the current postmaster. And what I have to say about this is, it is their plan. They had input, and it gives them the authority to do what everyone has indicated would make the post office successful and profitable, or at least break even, not profitable, break even. I would hope that everybody on this that votes yes for this, and I will be voting yes for it, would have the same expectation that the United States Post Office is not going to come back to Congress for more money. This is their plan, their ideas. It's bipartisan. It's now a time that they be held accountable to make sure we don't have to continue to bail them out. I hope that's our expectation, and I believe the American people should hold every person that votes yes on this accountable not to vote to give the post office another dime in the future. Thank you.
Madam Chairman,
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Session is now recognized.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. My kudos really to you, Chairman. What you have done is to gather together all those that would wish to provide input, as you did with me when you most graciously met with me for 30 minutes. And you listened to my ideas. You worked well with our ranking member Comer. And I think that this should be something that becomes a model for our committee, and I hope it is. I know we deal with lots of very difficult issues. The gentleman, Danny Davis, and I previously served on the last postal subcommittee back in around 2000. And Mr. Davis and I became friends because we wanted to view the post office in the way that he has spoken of and so many of my colleagues today have, and that is admiration for the men and women who provide service all across this country in a process that is in everybody's best interest. I too will be voting for this, but I, perhaps like Mr. Higgins and perhaps like our ranking member and perhaps like Mr. Keller, want to say that what we need to do is to continue working together and looking at the activities and the processes. I had a conversation yesterday with you, Chairwoman, and I said, we've got to make sure stamps don't go to 60 cents, don't go to 70 cents, don't go to 80 cents. And this is why I'm in favor of us looking at not only what they deliver and those indices that are very important and vital to that, but also that we look at the operational cost, the actual cost that caused the stamps to rise in their price. And so I want to be a part of this success. Mr. Raskin and I had a good conversation yesterday about working together for the best interest of the consumer, not just the post office also. And we believe that what Mr. Raskin has done and you, Madam Chairman, have been a combination of both the postal employees and the consumer so that we have confidence in this product. And I want to thank each of you on both sides of this aisle for working together and listening, but would hope that we are able to craft a bill that allows the flexibility to look at operational issues moving forward. I spent 16 years at a small company called AT&T. And for 16 years, I was on the operations into the business. And we had to constantly look at what we were doing to refine and take care of our costs so the consumer had an instrument, meaning the phone and access to data, on a cost-efficient basis. We still have that demand with us today for the stamp. And while you'd say, well, it's great across the country at 55 cents, and I believe it is, we want to make sure it's still a good deal for the consumer to where we continue riding and staying up with this nation. And I would say to you that I believe that the flexibility with the post office for us to look at future operational issues that include a balance of overtime that is a staggering number and people's lives as they work, combined with the expectation of performance of delivery for a product is still looked at, and I believe it will be. And so, Madam Chairwoman, I want to thank you, Carolyn. I've known you for 25 years, and your leadership is exceptional. Your listening processes include people, and I'm very proud to be not only a yes vote, but to say, job well done. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New York. All of those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is the recorded vote requested? No? Okay. Okay. I now call up H.R. 3077, the Postal Service Improvement Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3077 to require mail-in ballots to use the United States Postal Service barcode service to provide paid parental leave to officers and employees of the Postal Service and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3077 offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as the base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the amendment. The Postal Service Improvement Act is a straightforward, critically needed bill that addresses two great needs of the Postal Service: improved capabilities to support elections and assured paid family leave for our nation's postal employees. First, this bill includes legislation I introduced in February, the Vote by Mail Tracking Act. After the November 2020 election, in which a record number of mail-in ballots were cast, it has never been more important to ensure that election officials have the ability to track ballots once they're in the custody of the Postal Service. This bill would require that any ballot mailed in federal elections include a Postal Service barcode on the envelope that is unique to the individual ballot. This common sense requirement would enable boards of election to confirm when a ballot was sent and give voters confidence that their votes have been counted. In addition, the bill would require envelopes containing ballots to meet postal specifications, which would help these ballots be processed in a timely and efficient manner. Giving election officials the resources to track the status of ballots would create peace of mind and help further protect the honesty of our elections. In addition to the expansion of a vote by mail in the recent election, we need to invest in USPS employees who are delivering ballots, medication, and other packages throughout the pandemic. The bill would provide up to 12 weeks of paid parental leave for Postal Service and Postal Regulatory Commission employees in the event of the birth, adoption, or fostering of a child. In 2019, Congress passed legislation guaranteeing up to 12 weeks of paid parental leave for the majority of federal employees. But Postal Service employees were not included in this legislation. We now have the opportunity to correct that, and now by providing the equal benefit that the nearly 500,000 postal employees deserve. Paid parental leave is critical when welcoming a child, and it yields improved outcomes for the whole family. I've worked for many years to extend paid family and medical leave to federal employees because I believe it's essential for the federal government to be a model employer that can recruit and retain a strong workforce that provides the services that the American people depend on every day. This measure is one more step in that direction. These are common sense, simple provisions that should have bipartisan support. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm glad that we were able to come together in the Oversight Committee on the Postal Service Reform Act, which addresses fundamental issues keeping the Postal Service from being efficient and financially stable. However, I believe this bill, the Postal Service Improvement Act, is a bridge not only too far, but even a step backwards. The bill is divided into two parts. The requirement for ballots for federal elections mailed through the Postal Service to be traceable, trackable, and have the federal government reimburse states for that service, and the mandated extension of paid parental leave for all postal employees. I can't support these measures. First, injecting the Postal Service, a federal agency, further into our elections, which are run by the states, fundamentally alters how we have always voted in federal elections in this country. Such a momentous change to elections and the powers of the states should not be approached lightly through the guise of postal reform. Secondly, applying the Family and Medical Leave Act to postal employees is just a step backwards. Through the fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Acts, Congress expanded FMLA benefits to provide federal employees with paid leave for family reasons. These benefits far outpace what employees in the private sector receive. These benefits were not previously extended to Postal Service employees because of the significant cost burden they would impose on an independent agency with a large and already well-compensated workforce. The special status of the Postal Service as an independent, self-sufficient agency was designed to allow postal employees to unionize and collectively bargain to increase their benefits over time. By expanding FMLA paid parental leave benefits to postal workers, Congress would elevate postal benefits over private sector workers. The Postal Service is already overburdened with the benefits it has promised to its employees, and that's what's landed them in so much financial trouble. In fact, the Postal Service estimates that this mandated benefit could cost at a minimum $200 million annually, with a very real potential for cost to exceed $600 million annually and into the billions in extreme cases. The Postal Service should not be forced to absorb the cost of expanding additional benefits to its employees, especially not with their dire financial challenges. It's for these reasons that I oppose this bill and urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We only voted on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. So we now need to go back, and the question now occurs on H.R. 3076 as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
This is the last bill.
Madam Chair.
The ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably to the House. This is the last
Madam
bill.
Chairwoman,
Yeah.
could I just clarify for my colleagues? You were calling for the final vote on the previous bill.
Yes.
And
Okay.
I would ask that you, you ask us to
Revoted.
reiterate our vote
I
on that
thought we were
matter.
voting on H.R. 1930, were we not?
The question now occurs on H.R.
I'm on the right, that's
3076.
my mistake. I
the
completely
first bill.
apologize
That's
there.
the
I thought
first
we were on the,
As amended.
all right.
All those in favor say aye.
Ah,
Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably to the House.
I apologize, Madam Chair. That was my mistake. I've got my notes right in front of me, and I made a mistake.
Okay,
Apologize.
the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Now, is there any other amendments?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
I now call up, there's an amendment at the desk. Who seeks recognition? Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear is recognized.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3077, offered by Ms. Spear of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
I thank Madam Chair and my colleagues. I, too, want to extend my congratulations to the chair. As she pointed out to me just yesterday, I think, this is the hardest she's ever worked on a bill, and it paid off as it relates to the last bill. But I am introducing this amendment today, members, because, believe it or not, prohibition has been over for 90 years. 90 years, but somehow we never fixed it so that the U.S. Postal Service could, in fact, be in a position to mail and process liquor and wine. So for 90 years, they have had their hands tied while others were able to do that task. We can't have the Postal Service become break-even or even profitable if we keep tying its hands. So we also have an interest in protecting small businesses, microbreweries, small retail establishments, small wineries. They cannot ship their product because they either have to have the sanctions of the wholesalers or they don't ship. So this particular amendment unshackles the Postal Service and allows them to be able to ship wine and spirits and beer like every other entity that is a shipper in this country. It has a prohibition that shipments of alcoholic beverages in states that prohibit it would be remain in place, that those that receive the packages must be 21 years of age. The amendment makes no changes to the current system of alcohol regulation. It simply provides sellers with an additional shipping option. Now, during the pandemic, there was an 80% increase in the purchase of liquor and wine online. We understand why. But here is an opportunity where the Postal Service could, in fact, have benefited. It could not because we have prohibited them. It also is important to point out that the small breweries, distilleries, and wineries faced up to a 40% loss of revenue for lack of on-premise sales. A Harris poll found that 84% of regular craft beer drinkers want to be able to legally purchase beer via direct-to-consumer shipping to their homes. Wineries in 2020 shipped 8.3 million cases of wine directly to consumers. So why are we preventing the Postal Service from being able to ship product like this? It's for one reason. It's the wholesalers. And I'm saying to you, my colleagues, it's time to unshackle us from the power of the wholesalers and give the Postal Service the authority to ship wine and spirits. So with that, Madam Chair, I am going to withdraw the amendment for consideration because there does not appear to be the support for it at this time. But I'm telling you, we have an obligation to the Postal Service, we have an obligation to consumers, we have an obligation to small businesses that we tout that we want to protect them. They get screwed by this prohibition. With that, I yield back.
The amendment is withdrawn. Who now seeks recognition and for what purpose?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Connolly.
Madam Chair, with the indulgence of the Chair and the Ranking Member, I have 3 amendments, and I would propose that I go ad seriatim, if that's acceptable to the Chair.
Absolutely.
I thank the Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
This is the amendment on the Merit System Protection Board.
Amendment to H.R. 3077, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
I ask further reading of the
Without
amendment.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
I thank the Chair. This is a very simple amendment, and I think it's one of equity, Madam Chairwoman. It ensures that all Postal Service employees are provided the protection of due process rights and protections from retaliation for disclosing waste, fraud, and abuse. Congress created the Merit System Protection Board in 1979 to protect federal workers from prohibited personnel practices, including whistleblower retaliation, discrimination, and inappropriate political influence. Serving as guardians of expertise in government, the MSBP's mission is to protect the merit system principles and promote an effective federal workforce free of prohibited personnel practices. Current law, however, does not provide that protection for 7,500 of our United States Postal Service supervisors and managers to petition to appeal prohibited personnel practices to the MSPP. This amendment would create that distortion and extend normal MSPP protections in due process to those 7,500 supervisors and managers of the Postal Service. This has had bipartisan support in the past. Our committee's had a hearing on the Merit System Protection Board. On a bipartisan basis, all of us expressed concern about vacancies in the board and the backlog and the lack of functionality in ensuring due process. Our committee, as a committee, and our subcommittee in particular, have been champions of protecting whistleblowers. This amendment does just that, and I would urge its adoption.
I want to thank Congressman Connolly for this important amendment. This amendment would protect Postal Service supervisors and managers from retaliation, the same protection most postal workers already enjoy. It is a simple, good government amendment that has had bipartisan support for years, and I hope it will continue to have bipartisan support. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition on this bill?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Norman.
has the copy of the bill been distributed?
What?
Is it in
Yes.
our?
Yes, it has.
I inquire about what's the number, the amendment number?
The number of it, the clerk will report the number.
HR 3077, Amendment 1, Connolly.
37
3077.
3077. Thank you.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Higgins, you're now recognized.
Madam Chair, respectful question, ma'am. When will members of the committee be recognized to speak in opposition to any of the particular amendments that are being offered in sequence here?
Right now, you're allowed, right after each amendment, you're allowed to speak in support or in opposition. So you're
Okay,
recognized.
I apologize. I did not understand that at the moment. I seek recognition to speak in opposition to my colleague Representative Spears' amendment to 3077 regarding the shipping of alcohol through United States Postal Service.
Mr. Higgins, Representative Spear withdrew her amendment because it is not germane to the bill. So her amendment.
I apologize.
Her amendment
I
has been withdrawn.
apologize, madam. I did not.
Okay.
I did not hear that withdrawal. I withdraw my opposition. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition on the gentleman from Virginia's amendment? Hearing none, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. All those,
Madam Chair, which amendment exactly is it that we're voting on? What number?
it's a 3099. The clerk will report the number of the amendment.
This amendment is Amendment to HR 3077, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia. Right, Section Right of Appeal to Merit Systems Protection Board.
What is the number of the amendment?
Okay, so it's this one here.
Conley number 1. It's Conley number 1.
Yeah, it's this one here. Okay.
That sounds good, Madam Chairwoman.
So what are we doing?
Madam Chairwoman?
Who seeks recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I just wanted to engage with the ranking member on this amendment, if I may, Madam Chair. This simply extends Merit System Protection Board due process to the 7,500 managers and supervisors who were, for whatever reason, excluded from that protection. That's all this amendment does. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Okay. Can we go to a vote? Okay. The question now occurs on the amendment number 1, offered by the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Okay. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Connolly, you are now recognized.
I thank the chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3077, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
And Madam Chairwoman, I assume the clerk is designating this as Connolly Amendment number 2.
Yes, Connolly
Thank you.
Amendment B
For-
or 2.
For reference purposes. Thank you.
Okay.
Madam Chairwoman, the Postmaster General leads one of the largest federal agencies that's designed to run like a quasi-governmental entity, serving 160 million plus addresses in the United States every day. The Postmaster General and the Deputy Postmaster General are appointed by the Independent Board of Governors, who themselves are appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. The PMG and the Deputy PMG, once selected, have the same authorities as other Board of Governors members, including a full vote on that board. So the PMG and Deputy PMG have the authority of Senate-confirmed officials without actually having to go through similar background checks. These are immensely consequential leadership positions in the federal government and therefore require a robust vetting structure for the person selected to serve. This simple amendment to the Postal Service Improvement Act would mandate that an individual selected by the Postal Service Board of Governors to serve as Postmaster General or Deputy Postmaster General would be ineligible to carry out any duty of the position until their financial disclosure report is reviewed and signed by the Director of the Office of Governmental Ethics. I believe that that's a common sense, good government provision so that essentially the same kinds of requirements required, for example, of every member of the Postal Board of Governors, and for that matter, members of Congress have to file a financial disclosure statement. And in fact, as candidates, we are required to file financial disclosure statements. I think we should extend the same requirement for anybody who prospectively would be considered for Postmaster General or Deputy Postmaster General. This does not address the current occupant of that job. It would be something as a reform as we move forward required of anyone, Republican or Democrat or Independent, in any administration. And I urge its adoption.
I want to thank Congressman Connolly for this important good government amendment. This amendment would help protect prospective postmaster generals by ensuring that they are free of conflicts of interest before starting the job. This provision would make sure that once a new postmaster general takes over, they're able to do their work without having to worry about accidentally running afoul of the ethics requirements or being accused of unethical conduct. I urge my colleagues on both sides to support this amendment, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Okay, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia, and this is amendment number 2. All of those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have the amendment, and the amendment is adopted. Okay, moving along, Mr. Connolly. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Connolly seeks recognition. He's recognized.
I thank the chair. This is my third and final amendment to this bill,
Okay.
and I have an amendment at the desk I believe will be designated Connolly number 3.
Yes. The clerk will report Connolly number 3.
Amendment to H.R. 3077, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. During the COVID-19 pandemic, postal workers have proven how essential they are to our nation. Thousands of postal workers, in fact, put themselves at risk and developed COVID-19. Sadly, scores succumbed to it. While doing their job and serving every home and every business in America every day reliably. In fact, it was the one constant during this pandemic. We couldn't go to work normally. We couldn't go to daycare normally. Schools were closed. We couldn't go to restaurants. We couldn't go to concerts. We couldn't go to civic events. But the postman or postwoman was expected to deliver that mail at the same time every day, and by and large did. So current law, however, prohibits approximately 50,000 of those postal workers, namely supervisors and managers, from fair pay and benefits negotiations with the Postal Service itself. For example, the pay agreement for fiscal years 2016 through 2019 was delayed for 2 years into the 4-year term of that agreement. The delay resulted primarily from the restrictions of current law that tie the timeline of supervisor and manager contract negotiations to the culmination of collective bargaining processes for Postal Service unions. Once the Postal Supervisors and Managers Agreement was finalized, the supervisors and managers affected by the delay were not given any back pay for the delayed time period. Supervisors and managers can appeal these injustices to an independent fact-finding panel, but the Postal Service is under no obligation to accept that panel's final decision. This amendment, nearly identical to the Postal Supervisors and Management's Fairness Act, would extend the requirement for timely negotiations around compensation and benefits agreements for our postal supervisors. It would sever the statutory connection between the pay and benefits negotiations of public sector unions and the postal supervisors and managers. It would also establish that in the case of appeals, the independent fact-finding panel's decisions would in fact become binding. Experienced supervisors and managers are necessary and have proved how essential they are during this pandemic for the continued success of our Postal Service, and in the middle of this crisis, we need them more than ever. This bill brings fairness to them with long overdue rights postponed. I thank the Subcommittee Vice Chair, Katie Porter, for her help and enthusiastic support for this provision, and I yield back. I urge its adoption.
I want to thank Congressman Connolly for this amendment to ensure that postal supervisors can negotiate their contracts on a fair and equitable timetable. Postal supervisors should not have to wait for other postal employees to have contracts in place before they can negotiate their own contract. This amendment ensures fairness in postal supervisor negotiations and makes sure that postal supervisor benefits are not dependent on the outcome of any other negotiation. This is a matter of basic fairness, and I support this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment as well. I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Does anyone seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Moving right along. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to congratulate you and Mr. Comer and Mr. Connolly and Ms. Lawrence for your great work on getting the postal reform bill done. That was a major accomplishment. You all deserve credit. I think that'll make a huge difference going forward. I also want to recognize we had a bunch of folks from the postal unions who were very important in helping us work out the differences, and we had great agreement from all of the unions. But Bob Losey from the mail handlers, Corey Keller and Jim Sauber from the National Association of Letter Carriers, Paul Schwartz from the rural letter carriers, Katie Maddox also now with the mail handlers, and Judy Beard with the APWU. So great credit to them. My amendment, Madam Chair, this amendment would authorize $8 billion for the Postal Service to acquire an electric fleet of postal vehicles and construct electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. It would also mandate that at least 75% of the...
Mr. Lynch, for one moment, please. The clerk needs to report the amendment.
Oh, okay.
Amendment to H.R. 3077, offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to continue explaining his amendment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Clerk. Madam Chair, this amendment would authorize $8 billion for the Postal Service to acquire an electric fleet of postal vehicles and construct electric vehicle charging infrastructure. It would also mandate that at least 75% of the Postal Service's new fleet be electric or zero-emission vehicles. Moreover, it would require the Postal Service to acquire only electric or zero-emission vehicles after the year 2030. And I want to thank my distinguished colleague, Ms. Lawrence of Michigan, for co-sponsoring this amendment. At over 231,000 vehicles, the Postal Service operates roughly one-third of the entire vehicle fleet owned by the Federal Government. The majority of postal vehicles are classified as long life and have been in service for an average of nearly 30 years. Purchased as early as 1987, these trucks are operating long past their life expectancy of 24 years. Long-life mail trucks are widely recognized as gas guzzlers, averaging less than 10 miles per gallon, and consume over 85 million gallons of gasoline per year. They're also associated with high unscheduled maintenance costs and do not even include basic safety features such as anti-lock brakes, airbags, or seatbelt reminders. As evidenced by the hundreds of reports nationwide, this deteriorating fleet is also highly susceptible to catching fire, presenting a continued safety risk to postal workers and the public at large. Clearly, as we continue to take collective action across the Federal Government to electrify Federal fleets, enhance the environmental sustainability of Federal agencies, and promote a government-wide transition to clean energy alternatives, there's no better place to start than our own Postal Service. This authorizing amendment will facilitate and accelerate these shared goals. It accords with the Executive Order 14,008 issued by President Biden in January of this year and the President's American Jobs Plan. Both call for the procurement of clean and zero-emission vehicles for Federal, state, local, and tribal fleets, including the United States Postal Service. This amendment also largely mirrors language included in H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, legislation introduced by Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Peter DeFazio and passed by the House last year. That would rebuild our nation's transportation system and infrastructure to maximize climate resilience. It also reflects the fleet modernization and sustainability goals set forth by the Postal Service in its recent Delivering for America 10-year operational plan. According to the Postal Service, they say, quote, "We welcome support from Congress that advances the goal of a Postal Service vehicle fleet with zero emissions and the necessary infrastructure to support it. An additional investment of $8 billion is needed to electrify our delivery vehicle fleet to the maximum extent that is operationally feasible." Close quote. So absent this critical funding, the Postal Service reports that it can only ensure that 10% of the vehicles planned for future purchase under its next-generation delivery vehicle contract will be electric or zero-emission. The electrification of our postal fleet will dramatically reduce the Postal Service's carbon footprint to the great benefit of the health, safety, and sustainability of our communities nationwide. A transition to electric or zero-emission mail trucks will also augment our efforts to mitigate health disparities among our most vulnerable vulnerable populations that stem from air and noise pollution. So I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself. I want to thank Congressman Lynch for this incredibly important amendment. The Postal Service's fleet is outdated, dangerous, and gas-guzzling. While it's in the process of acquiring a new fleet, it is critical that the vehicles it purchases are electric. However, the Postal Service has told us that it cannot currently afford electric vehicles and the necessary infrastructure for them. That's why it's critical that we give them the help they need to electrify their fleet. This amendment will make sure that the Postal Service has all the funding it needs and ensures that the money will indeed be used to electrify the fleet and build electric vehicle infrastructure. I think this is one of the most important and realistic things we can do to help the environment today, which is why I've sent numerous letters to the Biden administration and to the chairs of the Transportation Committee, urging them to focus on electrifying the postal fleet. The last letter, which the gentleman from Massachusetts, Congressman Lynch, joined me along with Brenda Lawrence and Mr. Connolly. We, along with 56 other members, sent a letter to the President and to others in support of this idea. We need to move on it. I agree with you completely. So I strongly urge the support of this amendment, and I yield back. The gentleman is recognized from Kentucky. Ranking Member Comer.
Madam Chair, just to be clear, I'm about to speak on Mr. Lynch's amendment.
Okay.
Right, okay, right?
Right.
All right, just making sure. We had a little confusion. With all due respect to the sponsor of the amendment, these types of mandates are what has gotten the Postal Service in the financial shape it's in today. I believe that the earlier compromise bill, which we passed out of this committee in a bipartisan fashion, is a good vehicle for the Postal Service to begin to take steps of necessary reform. And when we try to further mandate, when political people try to further mandate Green New Deal type policies on these federal agencies that in the post office's situation is supposed to be self-sufficient, it's just making things much more difficult. The Postal Service needs to focus on delivering the mail on time in a cost-effective manner. And I think that we addressed that situation. I think we passed as good a bill as could possibly be passed in a compromised fashion out of this committee earlier, and I just encourage everyone to oppose this amendment. And I also want to say publicly, I do not think that this should be a part of the infrastructure bill either. I think when we're talking about infrastructure in America, we need to focus on the basic definition of infrastructure: roads, bridges, waterways, rural broadband, infrastructure that we need to move America forward. So I strongly encourage opposition to this amendment, and I yield back.
Madam Chair.
I thank the chair. I rise in support, enthusiastic support of this amendment. The ranking member says that the function of the postal office is to deliver the mail, and let's focus on that, and I agree with that. But you can't deliver the mail if you don't have vehicles to do it. The Postal Service manages the second largest vehicular fleet in America. And the average age of that fleet per vehicle is 28 years. What could go wrong with that? They are gas guzzlers. They require high maintenance. They break down. They are inefficient, and they are polluters. Other than that, it's a perfect fleet. This is not just a Democratic idea. I will remind my friend from Kentucky that it was the Republican majority Board of Governors last spring that came to us and said, we need capital investment. We need a fund to help stabilize revenue, but we also need $20 billion to help us with capital investment, the largest chunk of that being vehicular replacement. So we're doing what the Republican majority Board of Governors asked for last spring. And we're doing it as an investment to ensure the point my friend from Kentucky correctly makes, making sure that the Postal Service can live up to its mandate. I believe that this is a groundbreaking investment that will have huge return for our constituents, especially in rural areas, at risk of delivery disruptions because of the maintenance and longevity issues associated with postal vehicles. And this is sort of a twofer. We get to jumpstart electric vehicles and their production here in the United States while also providing the capital investment the Postal Service badly needs. I think this is a wise and prudent investment. I congratulate my friend from Massachusetts for his leadership in this issue, and I look forward to voting for the amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks a recognition?
Madam
Mr.
Chairman.
Norman, you're
Madam
now
Chair.
Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
The chair recognizes Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Chair Maloney. Let me just echo what my friend from Kentucky, Congressman Comer, emphasized. This should not be in the infrastructure bill at this time. Secondly, Mr. Connolly, I agree with you that the age of the fleet of the 231,000 cars and trucks is 18 to 22 years old. Let me point out there are bridges in this country that are pushing 80 to 100 years old that are structurally deficient. And, you know, when you define priorities, this is a perfect example of not having priorities. And you know, there's not enough money to print that to satisfy all of the infrastructure needs in this country, leading with bridges, roads, water, sewer lines that are far older than this, that will have a return on investment that this will not have when you relate it to the other needs. And finally, with the Postal Service, I think they're running in the red. They are been losing money for a long period of time, and to not have any offsets that they have to come up with in cost savings and just hand over $8 billion is no different than dropping money from a helicopter and saying, let's do this now. It's the wrong time, it's the wrong thing, it's the wrong priority. And quite frankly, I think this is, again, should not be included in this infrastructure bill just from the priority's sake and just for the fact that there's no incentive for them to try to run at a profit or at least a break-even point. So I will be opposing this bill, this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair
Madam
Higgins.
Chair, can you hear me?
Yes,
This
I
is
can.
Congresswoman
Ms. Lawrence is now recognized, and then Mr. Higgins. Ms. Lawrence is now recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you so much. I rise today in total support of this bill. I want to emphasize again that the Postal Service has the largest fleet outside the military. And one of the things that we know is that the postal vehicle is something that is recognizable around this country. And the fact that we in Congress, because we lack vision and understand that the transformation to electric vehicles is happening all around us. You will be having this conversation about the military as well. And what we are saying is that as the body that has oversight over the Postal Service, that we will not sit by and wait until everything else has transformed and then try to catch up. And I want to thank my good friend, Chairman Lynch, for his leadership on this issue. And we, immediately after taking office, we start talking about in introducing electric vehicles. You can't turn on TV without seeing an ad for electric vehicles. We know that we are today talking about the Postal Service, not the transportation bill. We can have that fight another day. But this fleet, as we know, must be replaced. Why would we spend money to replace it for a vehicle that is going to be outdated use? Because you know they're not going to be able to make another purchase for at least 20 more years. And so notably, the funds will be used to invest in the infrastructure needed to operate the electric vehicle fleet, which is going to be very critical. Each and every day, the Postal Service truck drives up into the neighborhoods of every community in this country. And to ensure that they continue to have their ability to do an effective job delivering their mail, the Postal Service would need to invest in their fleet. I want to thank Chairman Lynch again for his leadership. And I just want to ask my colleagues on the other side, don't get caught up in partisan talking points. Open your eyes and look at the need, and stop putting the government and government agencies behind the 8 ball as the world is moving forward and leaving us behind. We're struggling now with our intel and cybersecurity because we cannot keep up with other countries. And that rests on us. We have to be innovative, and we can't just keep doing the same thing we've always done for 50 and 40 years, and the world is moving forward. So with our military and now with our Postal Service, we are investing in the technology that will keep us in track. Now think about the Postal Service. It is competitive. I want every member to understand that. What is UPS doing? Converting to electric vehicles. What is FedEx doing? Converting to electric vehicles. Why should we tie the hands and not ensure that the federally funded, the federal agency of the Postal Service do not have the tools to be competitive with their fleets? And with that, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And again, thank Chairman Lynch for his leadership, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Higgins, you are now recognized to speak on this bill. Mr. Higgins?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I oppose the bill, and I find it intellectually unsound. My colleagues across the aisle have said that the postal fleet is gas guzzlers, and they only get the average 10 miles per gallon. Of course they guzzle gas. They sit still most of the time. They go from post box to post box. They're sitting still. You're getting 0 miles to a gallon when you're sitting still and the engine is running, which means that an electric vehicle is going to be an electricity guzzler. Of course, whatever the range of that electric vehicle is, it's going to be greatly reduced, because most people don't drive 10 feet and stop, or 20 yards and stop for a little while.
That's precisely when you want to use an electric vehicle. That's
Obviously,
the battery is cheap.
obviously, this is not going to work. And to compare with UPS and FedEx, the large difference is that they make money. They earn money. They're not getting bailed out by the federal government. And converting the military and electric deuce and a half, my goodness gracious. This is exactly the kind of the DC thing. You talk about political motivation here to speak to the base. This will be a burden on the post office. You're going to have little electric postal vehicles broke down all over. What are you going to do with the batteries, the toxic waste batteries? I respect the effort. I admire your spirit, but I oppose the amendment, and I yield.
Mr. Higgins, would you yield just for a second?
I have yielded, and yes, sir, you'll have to be recognized by the chair. I apologize.
I was simply going to point out that the difference between UPS and FedEx in being able to make money is they do not have a universal service mandate by law. The Postal Service has a universal service mandate. It must serve American households and American businesses, and it cannot cherry pick routes or markets. And that is both the beauty and the burden of having a universal postal service that is not a private entity. And so I think we're comparing apples and oranges when we point out the former make a profit, and the latter does not. I thank the chair.
Does anyone else seek recognition?
Madam Chair.
Ms. Spear is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to associate myself with this amendment and Mr. Lynch's proposal. I remember when Mr. DeJoy was here recently, and I asked him about the fleet of vehicles. We are buying $482 million of new vehicles because they have outlasted what their lifespan was, which was 24 years, and now 28 years old. So to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that are concerned about the fact that we would be purchasing new vehicles, we're doing that anyway. I asked him at the time if he would be buying electric vehicles, and his response was, well, maybe 10%. But the company that has gotten the contract doesn't know how to make electric vehicles. So we have these gas guzzlers at 10 miles a gallon. They're too small today for the e-commerce that requires us to have larger vehicles to respond to the size of these boxes. The GAO indicated that we were spending $2 billion a year on maintenance of these vehicles. If we went to electric vehicles, there would be zero maintenance on the vehicles. We're spending $500 million a year on gas for these gas-guzzling vehicles. This is stupid not to support this amendment. And I think if the American public realized that we're spending $500 million now on more of the old technology, they would be laughing in our faces. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yield?
I yield.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I want to point out my friends on the other side of the aisle seem to be hung up on this idea that these mail delivery trucks are not part of the infrastructure. The Postal Service infrastructure is the mail delivery system. So the trucks that deliver the mail are an integral part of that system. Once we establish this charging infrastructure, it will also facilitate the adoption of that technology in the private sector as well. I could easily see where, which has already happened in the private sector, where you have the lines put in for charging infrastructure. It extends the system even further to the public. So we have an opportunity here, I think, really to look forward. Remember, the legislation requires that as of 2030, 9 years from now, that the Postal Service convert to fully electric vehicles. That's a long time. A lot of these newer trucks are coming out this year and next for electric vehicles. They have the capacity, they have the technology. It'll be here a lot sooner if we use the Postal Service as an example and as a catalyst for this infrastructure and for demonstrating the rightness of using zero-emission vehicles to deliver the mail. This will be a huge impact. Remember, these rural communities that have systems put in for recharging, this will be a catalyst for them as well on the private sector. I could even see in some of our smaller post offices where there'll only be a certain number of hours during the day where postal vehicles will be using those recharges, probably overnight because they work all during the day. Those stations would be open at the discretion of the postmasters, the local postmasters, whether that would be offered to the general public. So there's an opportunity here for a public and private benefit if we move forward with this proposal. The $8 billion did not come out of the blue. This was actually a request from the Postal Service. They identified the level of funding that they would need to convert, and So I just ask members to think closely about this and please support this amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes herself. I agree with my colleagues on moving forward with electric cars. Right now, Ford is building electric cars. General Motors, Elon Musk is building it. It is definitely the future. There is a vehicle. We now each get to put our request into the Mr. DeFazio, who's putting together the infrastructure bill on our side, and my top request is this: electric cars. So we can all put our requests in, and maybe we can get it in that bill. I agree that what is so beautiful about this idea is, as Mr. Lynch points out, it's the recharging stations all across the country, in every community, at every single post office. At every hamlet, every county, there's a post office, and you'd have the infrastructure to move the country forward in the direction that we need to go. I now, hearing no other people wanting to speak, the question now occurs on the amendment.
Madam Chair.
Yeah. Yes. Mr. Donalds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Listen, I heard it said in our debate over this amendment that the post office, Mr. Joy specifically said that he was going to spend about $480 million, $500 million on, updating the fleet, and that if we did not authorize $8 billion, that the American people will laugh in our face. And I got to tell you, Madam Chair, having come from the private sector, if you have a choice between spending $500 million or $8 billion on your inventory fleet, that's a no-brainer. And I understand the other side wanting to move forward with a green agenda for the future of the country. Totally understand where you're coming from, but this doesn't make any fiscal sense at all. The post office has not been in the black in, decades, and we're going to give them $8 billion for their fleet. How about the post office get their fiscal house in order, and Mr. Joy and the people over there actually use their resources that they have for everything that they charge the American people to deliver the mail to actually update their fleet? Let's have them do that in an orderly process over time, not just give them $8 billion to basically use the post office as a vehicle for the ecological social change that some in this chamber actually want to see happen. I think that's the wrong approach. We got a money problem, folks. Like, the debt ceiling's coming too. Let's not sit here and act like that's not coming. It is coming. And if you look at what the inflation report was that just came out yesterday about the inflationary pressures that are happening in our country due to, in part, excessive spending, sending another $8 billion out the door for the Postal Service to build an entirely new green fleet overnight in 1 year's time is not fiscally sound. It's not fiscally responsible. And I would argue that small business owners across the United States would be looking at us in disdain if we sent $8 billion out the door just so that the post office can buy an entirely electric fleet. That does not make any fiscal sense, especially in light of what's happening in the United States today. I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs.
Madam Chair, I seek recognition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair, it was mentioned by one of my Democrat colleagues that there would be a $2 billion annual amount of savings in maintenance alone if we went to electric vehicles. Well, if there's going to be a $2 billion annual savings in maintenance, then why do we need to give them $8 billion to buy electric vehicles? I mean, by simply buying the electric vehicles at the $500 million a year, you could certainly save the maintenance to continue to buy those electric vehicles. So as a person who also came from the private sector and who understands business, I cannot support this as being fiscally responsible. So I would encourage all the members to vote against this amendment, and I yield back.
Madam Chair,
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Congresswoman Lawrence.
Brenda Lawrence is now recognized.
So do I hear my colleague offering a friendly amendment to adjust the offering from 8 to 6 because there'll be a savings of $2 billion with the fleet? Because we need to move forward. And for those of you all who are on this committee who refer to the private sector. If you had the restrictions that the Postal Service had in private industry, you would not make a profit. The Postal Service is not designed to be a profit-making entity. We absolutely know it's in the Constitution. It is a service. It is not a business. We fund government agencies and regulate them every day. So to be naive and say the Postal Service is this and that, they can't even set their own prices. UPS and FedEx can. They can go out and buy a fleet. They can increase services and do whatever they want. Because the Postal Service is a government regulated entity, then they must be in compliance to our rules. And for any of us to sit here and say that the world isn't moving toward electrified vehicles. And none of us was around when, I don't think, when they had to build an infrastructure of gas stations because you can't drive your car but so many miles before you have to refuel. So we cannot put our head in the sand and say the world is not, especially our country, is not moving toward electrified vehicles. So the charging stations is very much going to be a part of our infrastructures, just like we know that gas stations are part of our infrastructure. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Mr. Comer is now recognized to speak on the amendment.
Madam Chair, if I may, I would like to yield some time to Representative Donald.
Is recognized, Mr. Donald.
Thank you, Mr. Comer. Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, in response to the previous comment, I would argue that, yes, they are a government-related entity, and as such, then the government has a responsibility to not over-regulate the entity that we seem to be bailing out every single year. And this amendment only provides more regulations and more mandates to the Postal Service. If we tell them you have to spend $8 billion to essentially not only retrofit your entire fleet to electric vehicles, but then also build out a necessary recharging and electric grid formation to support that, that puts more regulatory burden on the Postal Service and is going to make it more difficult for them to actually, forget turn a profit, just break even, stop being a burden to the taxpayers. And this is the problem. And so I'll yield in one moment, Mr. Lynch. I'll yield in one moment. But I think it's important that we have to identify and understand that, yes, we do have a responsibility to set certain measures for the Postal Service. I totally acknowledge that. So what we should be doing is not adding further layers of burden to the Postal Service through mandates and through just additional funding measures, because the members of Congress believe that we have the ability to judge what the energy infrastructure will look like in the future. The reality is this: we may think we know what the energy infrastructure of the future is going to look like, but we don't even know what the new innovations are going to be. And so we should not put these burdens on the Postal Service and on the operations to basically create the field that we want to see. We should remove that burden from them. We should not do this and let them organize their operations like any other entity would organize their operations from a delivery standpoint. We should not mandate that, and I will yield to Mr. Lynch.
I thank the gentleman, and I respect his argument, but
The time belongs to Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer reclaiming your time, and now Mr. Comer now recognizes Mr. Lynch.
thank you, Mr. Comer. I appreciate that, Mr. Ranking Member. I just want to point out that the gentleman has said multiple times that this is a mandate, and I just want to point out that this is not something we are imposing on the Post Office. They asked us for this purpose. They asked for $8 billion for this, to do this, to convert the gas system of these older trucks. They want to go electric. They want to go zero emission. They think that is the future. They've asked us for this money and for this authorization, and we are saying yes to the Post Office. So we are not imposing a burden. They are asking for, this is a request from them. It's not a burden. It's not a mandate from us. We're saying yes to their request. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Representative Lynch. All of those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those,
Aye.
all those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The gentleman has called for a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 7 and Committee 5B, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. So this, we will vote later. Who now seeks recognition?
I seek recognition. This is Raja Krishnamurthy with an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3077, offered by Mr. Krishnamurthy of Illinois.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment. Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Hey, thank you so much, Chairwoman. I urge my colleagues to vote yes in support of my amendment to the Postal Service Improvement Act. My amendment contains the same language as the DeJoy Act, which many members of this committee have already co-sponsored. For decades, individual Americans and small businesses across the nation have relied on the Postal Service to deliver the mail in a timely and professional manner. This trust has made the Postal Service an indispensable resource for small businesses and individuals, especially during the pandemic. The Postal Service has long been seen as the most trusted government entity with an outstanding 91% approval rating from the very public it serves. Recently, we've seen poor leadership at the Postal Service, and that has challenged the stellar performance and reputation that the USPS has otherwise earned. From mail delays to a low 71% delivery rate, the Postal Service cannot survive if service is subpar. To combat constant attacks on the Postal Service, my amendment would require the Postal Service to maintain the 1 to 3 day delivery standard for first-class mail. Statistics show that the American people consider the Postal Service to be essential, especially for those who rely on the mail for medication, for receiving bill payments from their customers, to receive vital stimulus checks as well as Social Security checks. Simply put, slowing down the mail and charging more for worse service is a great way to hurt local economies and negatively impact the health and financial well-being of the very people that the USPS serves. According to the National Small Business Association, and I'm a former small business person, so this resonates with me, over 65% of its members prefer the Postal Service over private companies. This statistic climbs to 70% for small businesses with 5 or fewer employees. As a former small business person, I know these changes would seriously make me reconsider using the USPS if service standards were to decline. And I'm just going to diverge from my script for a moment. I think all of us use the USPS even for our constituent services mail, and each of us sends out thousands of pieces of mail virtually every week responding to constituents. And I think all of us know that for extremely timely pieces of mail that we have to get in the hands of our constituents, a lot of times we're emailing them, we're scanning them, some people are faxing them. The point is that people, unfortunately, are starting to work around the USPS because of delivery delays, and that's very, very bad for the long-term health and well-being of the USPS. Moving forward, we must ensure that the post office can be a driver of economic recovery and success as we rebound from the ongoing pandemic. The success of Main Street is tied to the success and reliability of the USPS. In many cases, the Postal Service acts as a lifeline to communities and individuals. This amendment, which I'm offering, ensures that individuals across the country will have reliable access to the mail no matter where they live. By preventing the weakening of first-class mail standards, we can actively support our constituents as well as small businesses. I urge my colleagues to seize this moment by voting yes on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlemen, reserves. Who else seeks recognition? The chair recognizes herself. I want to thank Congressman Krishnamurthy for offering this important and time-sensitive amendment. Since last July, when Postmaster General DeJoy introduced his operational reforms, service performance has indisputably suffered. Performance has still not returned to the level it was at before these changes. But instead of improving performance, the Postmaster General is moving forward with changing service standards to meet the current poor performance. I don't think that's the way to go at all. Before Mr. DeJoy took over, the Postal Service was delivering at least 90% of the mail on time, and often much more than 90%. The Postal Service clearly has the ability to at least get close to meeting the existing standards if it so chooses. So I think this amendment is a good idea, and while I understand that it won't get bipartisan support today, I personally support the amendment, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Does anyone seek recognition? Mr. Connolly seeks recognition. You're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Krishnamurthy, for this amendment. Essentially, what this amendment does is simply return us to the quality standards of service delivery that existed on January 1, 2021. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have referred to their private sector experience. I spent 20 years in the private sector, and I can tell you that my company did not say to its customers, we're going to lower the quality of service to you, and we're going to raise the cost to you while we're at it. That would have been a surefire recipe for the CEO to be fired or for the company to go out of business. That is not a business model I'm aware of that is very successful. And yet that is what we're being asked to accept in the current circumstances. Mr. Krishnamurthy is simply saying, no, we're going to preserve service standards so that, in fact, the Postal Service can be successful and compete. Many of us on both sides of the aisle have been hearing a rising crescendo of complaints from our constituents about what's happening to delivery and delay in their mail. And it's alarming them. It's more than an inconvenience for some, especially those who rely for essential medical equipment and pharmaceuticals on mail delivery. This is a very important amendment that sets a minimum standard I think all of us can live with and ought to embrace. I thank Mr. Krishnamurthy for introducing this amendment. I look forward to supporting it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Moving right along, who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Lynch is now recognized.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3077, offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is now recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment is very simple. This would require the United States Postal Service, in coordination with the U.S. Census Bureau, to develop a plan for the engagement of postal letter carriers and/or mail handlers in the enumeration process of the 2030 decennial census, including end-to-end testing. In developing this plan, the Postal Service will be required to consult with the relevant labor organization representing postal workers, postal letter carriers, and/or mail handlers, and the Postal Service must submit its plan to Congress within 180 days of enactment and identify necessary revisions to the postal regulations and current law to facilitate the participation of letter carriers in enumeration activities. So here's what this boils down to. we have letter carriers and mail handlers who go to every home in America 6 days a week. Then we have a separate process with the Census where we hire thousands, tens of thousands of people at the last phase, the enumeration phase of the census, to do exactly the same thing, to go to the doors of individual voters. So the idea here is we already have people that are doing that. They're already on the payroll. They do it not 365 days, but 6 days a week. And so they know who's getting mail. They know how many people are in the house. They have a familiarity with their own neighborhood. They walk those routes every single day, 6 days a week. And so the idea here is we should be able to utilize that workforce, that experienced workforce, to help with the census. I think it would save enormous amounts of energy and money doing it that way. We just have to capitalize on the talent that's out there. So that's what this amendment would require. It just requires them to come up with a plan jointly, the Census Department and also the Postal Service. And again, it's just for that last enumeration step of the census, and I think it would be highly efficient. So that's all I have, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. Is there further discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. This is Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz.
The
I have an
gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you. I have an amendment at the desk.
No, we're on the Lynch Amendment. We have to dispose of the Lynch Amendment, Ms.
Oh,
Wasserman.
forgive me. I heard him yield back and assumed we had moved on. Forgive me.
No, I'm
I got you.
offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? The amendment, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. I know. Gentlewoman from Florida is now recognized.
Thank you. Sorry to jump the gun there, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
And I ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Amendment to H.R. 3077, offered by Ms. Wasserman Schultz of Florida.
Thank you, Mr.
Without
Chairman.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment today would ensure that all members of Congress, including those on this committee, which has jurisdiction over the United States Postal Service, can tour a postal facility. Last year, like many members, I began hearing from my constituents and businesses about extensive mail delays in receiving medicines, bills, and other timely deliveries. I heard from USPS employees worried about growing dysfunction inside those facilities. And I received photos of pallets of undelivered mail clogging the workroom floors, sorting machines unplugged, and empty trucks leaving facilities to meet new operational deadlines. As the concerns grew louder and in the midst of a global pandemic where on-time mail delivery was even more vital, I felt it was necessary as an elected representative to see firsthand what was taking place in these facilities. Unfortunately, like several other members of Congress from across the country, I was denied entry when I tried to observe a morning shift at 2 USPS facilities in my district. There was absolutely no justification for turning me away. We called well in advance to alert the Postal Service that I planned to come tour a local facility in South Florida. I had 2 USPS employees with me who were able to escort me throughout the facility. I posed no risk to anyone's health and safety, just like when I toured USPS facilities in the past without incident. But this time was more urgent. My constituents had flooded the phone lines of my office asking for answers and looking for help. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, the operational capability of postal facilities can severely impact all of our communities. Every one of us represents seniors and veterans who use the USPS to receive their prescriptions. We represent business owners who rely on the Postal Service to complete routine transactions and rely on deliveries to stay afloat. This amendment would ensure that no member of Congress could be turned away again while trying to conduct basic oversight at a postal facility, regardless of whether prior notice was submitted. To conduct proper oversight, we must bear witness to conditions that are accurate and representative, not situations that are staged or temporarily papered over. I urge all my colleagues who care about proper oversight of the Postal Service to vote yes And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentle lady yields back. I now recognize myself. I want to thank Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz for this thoughtful and important amendment. Congress and this committee in particular has a responsibility to provide rigorous oversight to ensure that the American people are well served. Last year, regrettably, the Postal Service unnecessarily prevented her and other members of Congress from performing site visits at postal facilities, effectively blocking in-person oversight. This amendment will make sure that Congress can perform site visits and see reality, not some ideal version of it. I urge strong support for this amendment, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Connolly is now recognized to speak on this amendment.
I thank the Chairwoman. I join her in applauding this amendment. I also was prevented from inspecting my major Postal Service facilities under the guise that because we were in the middle of a campaign cycle, that would be political activity. For a 2-year term, every one of us in this body is a sworn constitutional officer. We are members of the United States Congress, and we have a constitutional responsibility which should be respected by all entities in the public or quasi-public sector to provide oversight on behalf of the people we represent. And nobody gets to delimit that term of office, and nobody gets to delimit the responsibilities of that office that are clearly both enumerated and implied in the Constitution of the United States, including the post office. This amendment restores that balance. We shouldn't have to, but given what we went through last year, we do. And I believe that this is something that Republicans and Democrats can and ought to support. This isn't about a partisan issue. This is about the very role each and every one of us must play on behalf of our constituents and in fulfillment of our constitutional oath as members of Congress. I support the amendment.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentle lady from Florida. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Okay? Okay. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. The clerk will call the roll.
Madam Chair, let's be clear. This is on the amendment for the electric vehicles.
Yeah. Yes, this is on Mr. Lynch's electric vehicle amendment.
Just want to make sure everyone on Zoom understands what
Okay.
we're voting on.
All right. This is Lynch number 1 on electric vehicles.
Until it's your turn to speak.
And then we'll follow with a vote on final passage. The question now occurs. The clerk will call the roll. We will have it open for a long time so that everybody can vote on both sides. Okay.
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Connolly votes aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye. Raskin votes aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna?
No. No and no.
Mr. Mfume? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Ocasio-Cortez votes aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Tlaib?
Ms. Talib votes yes.
Ms. Talib votes aye. Ms. Porter? Ms. Porter? Ms. Bush? Mr. Davis?
Madam Chair, this is Cooper. How am I recorded?
Mr. Cooper recorded.
Mr. Cooper is not recorded.
I vote yes.
Mr. Cooper votes aye.
This is Ms. Porter. How am I recorded?
How is Mrs. Porter?
Ms. Porter is not
Right hand
recorded.
dominant?
Right.
Right hand dominant? Okay, good. I vote aye.
Ms. Porter votes aye.
This is Ms. Bush. How am I recorded?
How is Ms. Bush recorded?
Ms. Bush is not recorded.
Ms. Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye.
How is Congressman Gomez recorded?
How is Congressman Mill reported? We haven't gotten there yet.
I was thinking I was lost.
Mr. Davis?
Very excited.
Mr. Davis? How is Mr. Davis recorded?
Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
I'll turn on, you want me to turn on the video right now?
Aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson?
Senator Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Ms. Spear?
Spear votes aye.
Ms. Spear
Spear
votes
votes
aye.
aye.
Ms. Spear votes aye. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes aye.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley? Mr. Quigley?
Quigley votes aye.
Mr. Quigley votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Gosar?
No.
Mr. Gosar votes no. Ms. Foxx?
Ms. Foxx votes no.
Ms. Foxx votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Gibbs?
Gibbs votes no.
Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins?
No.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller?
No.
Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Clyde? Miss Mace? Mr. Franklin? Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
Fallon votes no.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds? Chairwoman Maloney?
Maloney votes aye.
Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Is there any member who has not voted yet?
David,
Madam Chairman, how?
Mr. Lynch?
How am I recorded?
Mr. Lynch is not recorded. Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mace votes no.
Davis votes no.
Madam Clerk?
Mace votes no.
Madam,
Okay. Who's permission to change, to register their votes?
Madam Clerk, inquiry.
How is Mr. Mfume recorded? The clerk, how many is Mr. Fume recorded? Is he recorded?
Mr. Mfume is not recorded.
Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam
Ms. Bush.
Who's speaking? Mr. Clyde, you're now recognized. How is he recognized? How did he vote?
Mr. Clyde is not recorded.
Mr. Clyde, how do you vote?
I vote nay.
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no.
Okay, who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chairman,
Mr. Davis, you're now recognized.
Davis votes aye.
Madam Chair, how's
Mr. Davis votes aye.
Who seeks recognition?
Representative Presley.
Representative Presley is recognized.
How am I recorded?
How is she recorded?
Ms. Presley is not recorded, and she's not on camera.
Oh gosh. I vote aye.
Please turn your
I am-
camera on.
Ms. Presley
My
votes
camera
aye.
is on. My camera is on. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Thank you. Who else seeks recognition?
Ms. Bush.
Mr. Heiss, you're now recognized.
How's Mr. Heiss recorded?
Mr. Heiss is not recorded.
Mr. Heiss votes no.
Mr. Heiss votes no.
Who else seeks recognition?
Ms. Bush.
Ms. Bush is now recognized.
Ms. Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye.
Okay, Ms. Bush votes aye. Who else seeks recognition?
John Sarbanes.
John Sarbine.
Mr. Sarbanes is not recorded.
Mr. Sarbanes, you're recognized.
I vote aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Who's speaking?
It's Raskin.
Raskin. Is Raskin recorded?
Mr. Raskin is recorded as aye.
You are recorded
Thank you.
as aye.
Below in this right.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Who seeks recognition?
Michael Cloud.
Who? Mr. Cloud, you're now recognized.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Cloud is not recorded.
Mr. Grossman is now recognized.
Mr. Cloud is not recorded.
Mr. Cloud,
Cloud is no.
Mr. Cloud votes no.
Mr. Grossman is now recognized.
Mr. Grothman votes no.
Who? Mr. DeSaulnier is now recognized.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Mr. DeSaulnier is not recorded.
Mr. DeSaulnier.
aye.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chairman, Sessions, yes. Sessions, no.
Mr. Sessions is now recognized, and he is a no.
Mr. Sessions votes no.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, Congresswoman Mace.
So are you going to take that back?
Congresswoman Mace is now recognized.
Mace votes no.
Okay.
Ms. Mace votes no.
Is there anyone else who seeks recognition?
Yeah, this is Krishnamurthy. How am I recorded?
Mr. Krishnamurthy, you are recorded as aye.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, who else seeks recognition? Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 24 ayes and 15 nays.
The amendment is agreed to. Amendment in the nature of a substitute. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No. No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Final passage on H.R. 3077. The question now occurs on favorability of reporting H.R. 3077 as amended. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the
Madam
ayes
Chair,
have
we
it,
ask for a
and the
recorded vote.
bill is agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton? Mr. Lynch?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Ocasio-Cortez votes aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Tlaib?
Talib votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Aye.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Ms. Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson?
Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence first votes aye.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley? Mr. Quigley?
Quigley votes aye.
Mr. Quigley votes aye. Mr. Comer?
Comer votes no.
Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Gosar?
No.
Mr. Gosar votes no.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Foxx? Ms. Foxx?
Oh, sorry, a no.
Ms. Foxx votes no. Mr. Heiss?
Heiss votes no.
Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud?
No.
Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs?
Gibbs votes no.
Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins?
No.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions?
Sessions, no.
Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller?
Keller votes no.
Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Clyde?
Clyde votes no.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace?
Mace votes no.
Ms. Mace votes no. Mr. Franklin?
Franklin votes no.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
Fallon votes no.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell? Mr. Donalds? Donalds votes no. Chairwoman Maloney?
Maloney votes aye.
Ms.
Will the
Maloney?
clerk just call through the names of the members who have not voted, so we can find out how they've recorded, so we don't have the yelling? Maloney votes aye.
Ms. Maloney votes aye. Mr. Khanna? Ms. Spear?
Spear, aye.
Ms. Spear votes aye. Ms. Presley? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Norman? Mr. Biggs? Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell, you're not on camera.
Sorry. Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Mr. Norman is in the waiting room to be recorded. Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? We are waiting for Mr. Norman to get recognized.
He's not in the lobby.
So is he coming or not? Should we wait or let him come?
Madam
Yeah.
Chair, it's Representative Harrell. Which item is this that we're voting on at the moment?
We're voting on final passage of H.R. 3077.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is he coming or not? Open. We're going to hold the vote open for 3 more minutes, and then if they're not here, we're missing people on both sides of the aisle, but we have to go forward. We have other bills that need to be considered, and people have planes to catch and other assignments. So we will keep it open for 3 minutes, and then in 3 minutes we will vote, and that's it. The clerk will report the tally when she is ready.
On this vote, we have 23 yeas and 17 nays.
H.R. 3077 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 1930, the Federal Advisory Committee Transparency Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 1930 to amend the Federal Advisory Committee Act to increase the transparency of federal advisory committees and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1930, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the amendment. I introduced the Federal Advisory Committee Transparency Act with Ranking Member Comer during Sunshine Week in March. I appreciate the Ranking Member's leadership on this bill, which would improve the transparency accountability of federal advisory committees. The Federal Advisory Committee, or FACA, was enacted with the goal of ensuring that committees that provide advice to federal agencies and the President operate with transparency. This bill would close loopholes that agencies use to avoid complying with the law. For example, agencies often avoid the requirements of FACA by conducting advisory committee businesses through subcommittees. This bill will make it clear that FACA applies to subcommittees as well as parent committees. The bill also clarifies that a committee set up by a contractor is subject to FACA if it is formed under direction by the President or an agency. Just last year, Government Accountability Office issued a report that identified weaknesses in agency implementation of FACA, including that FACA does not require agencies or committees to post documents online. Under the Federal Advisory Committee Act amendments, agencies would be required to disclose how advisory members are chosen and whether they have financial conflicts of interest. They would also be required to disclose if they are appointed to provide their own expertise and who they work for if they are representing a specific interest. This bill has passed the House several times without opposition, including last Congress. There is a bipartisan companion bill sponsored by Senators Portman and Maggie Hassan, and I am optimistic that with bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, the bill will become law. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Federal advisory committees have a long and important history in the United States government, beginning when President George Washington sought out the advice of an ad hoc committee during the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. In the more than 225 years that have followed, advisory committees have continued to be a valuable part of congressional and executive branch policymaking. The Federal Advisory Committee Act was created to improve the efficiency and transparency of federal advisory committees. It's also reduced advisory committee duplication across the government. To be clear about what we're talking about here, in 2015, there were more than 1,000 federal advisory committees with more than 72,000 members. The cost the American taxpayer over $360 million in 2015 alone. Unfortunately, since the law was enacted in 1972, agencies have used loopholes to bypass transparency requirements. H.R. 1930, the Federal Advisory Committee Transparency Act, ensures federal advisory committees are truly transparent and working for the betterment of the United States government and the American people. First, the bill requires agency heads to consider recommendations for advisory committee members from interested parties and the public. It also requires members be selected without regard to political affiliation. Second, the bill increases transparency by requiring agencies to publish all their advisory committees on agency websites and fully disclose the establishing charter, members, and committee activities. Also, detailed minutes from advisory committee meetings must be published. This will provide the public with true transparency into the sources and nature of policy advice our agencies are receiving. The Federal Advisory Committee Transparency Act ensures greater transparency into federal advisory committee operations and membership. This will help Congress and the American taxpayer hold these advisory committees accountable. I appreciate the Chairwoman's partnership in reintroducing this bill, and I strongly encourage the support of it. I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 1930 as amended favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably to the House. I now call up H.R. 2485, the Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 2485 to require the Director of Government Publishing Office to establish and maintain an online portal accessible to the public that allows the public to obtain electronic copies of the congressionally mandated reports in one place.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2485, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I thank you for considering the bill today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be back on the committee. Even in a short term, I have to learn the secret handshake again. I do also want to express my extraordinary gratitude to Mr. Comer, the ranking member, for sponsoring this important piece of legislation with me. And I thank the full committee for its commitment to government transparency. H.R. 2485 will make all agency reports available to Congress and releasable under FOIA on one website at no cost to the American public. Each year, federal agencies submit thousands of reports to Congress containing a wealth of information that enables the public to better understand how well federal agencies are or are not fulfilling their basic responsibilities, from ensuring the safety of drugs to food supply to protecting the environment, monitoring the soundness of our financial institutions. Unfortunately, many of the reports simply sit collecting dust in committees they're delivered to, or are posted in numerous and confusing places on dozens of agency websites, rarely to be seen or thought of again. In fact, the only comprehensive list of congressionally mandated reports is printed in paper format each year by the clerk of the House and is available only by request, provided you even know it exists. My bill would, for the first time, create a single website where the public and members of Congress can easily search, sort, and download all congressional reports from agencies. Ultimately, this will help us conduct better research and oversight of agency and will allow the public to learn about what agencies are doing with their hard-earned tax dollars. This bill is meant to be a window into the workings of government and to ensure the government's business is done transparently and accountable to the people it serves. I urge my colleagues to support this straightforward bill and vote yes. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. The Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act is a common sense measure that will make the government more transparent and accountable. I want to commend Congressman Quigley and Ranking Member Comer for their years of dedicated work on this bill. The bill would create a one-stop shop where Congress and members of the public can access agency reports to Congress. Federal agencies submit thousands of reports to Congress each year. This bill will improve congressional oversight by making it easy to find and access reports. This bill will also give the public access to agency reports. Currently, members of the public have to file FOIA requests to obtain some agency reports to Congress because many of these reports are not currently available online. I urge all members to support this bill, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Madam Chair, I'm very happy to see this good government bill up for consideration in our committee so quickly. The Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act, long championed by my colleague, Mr. Mike Quigley, represents an honest effort to modernize Congress and improve the Article I power of the legislative branch. This bill does this by bolstering the ability of Congress to access and understand the thousands of legally mandated reports compiled by the executive branch and sent to Congress each year. It's estimated that federal agencies write and send to Congress and committees like ours over 4,000 written reports every 2 years. That's a lot of valuable information. These legally mandated reports contain insights into the activities of federal agencies, such as the status implementing a newly established program or general updates to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. However, there is currently no central inventory for congressional members, staff, or the public to access these reports. Most reports are sent over via email and can get lost in the shuffle of an ever-changing and evolving Congress. Or they're only sent to specific committees, which prevents the rest of Congress and public from viewing them. This bill would fix that glaring problem. The bill establishes a central and publicly available portal of all these reports at the Government Publishing Office. Congress and members of the public will be able to fully search, sort, and download reports from this website. This gives the whole Congress and America's citizens convenient access to all executive agency reports submitted to Congress, reports that the taxpayers paid for in the first place. But do not worry, classified and sensitive information will be protected in keeping with the principles of the Freedom of Information Act. In summary, once Congress can get a handle on all the mandated reports, we can take actions to reduce any unnecessary agency reporting burdens. After all, what's the point of requiring a report to be written if no one's going to read it? Simply, this reform will help save taxpayer dollars, improve congressional oversight, and assure public accountability of the executive branch. I thank my colleague, Mr. Quigley, for his work over the years on this good government bill, and I urge every member to support this. I yield back.
Anyone else seek recognition? Anyone else? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. If not, the question now occurs on reporting H.R. 2485 as amended favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is reported favorably to the House. I now call up H.R. 2681, the Integrity Committee Transparency Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 2681, to amend the Inspector General Act of 1978 to require the Integrity Committee of the Council of the Inspectors General.
Okay, without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2681, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes. Mr. Connolly is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for bringing up H.R. 2681, the Integrity Committee Transparency Act, for this markup. This is a bipartisan bill, co-sponsored with my ranking member, Mr. Heiss of Georgia. Previous Congress, it was sponsored by Mr. Meadows, the ranking member and former chairman of our subcommittee on government operations. Inspectors General play a critical role in promoting accountability in federal government operations by rooting out fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. To execute this responsibility effectively, IGs and their offices must remain, as I say, pure as driven snow, operating with the highest standards of conduct and integrity if we're going to accept them as the absolute arbiter of truth in their investigative work. To ensure that IGs are held accountable to that standard, the Inspector General Act of 1978, as amended, directed the Integrity Committee of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, known as CIGI, to timely review and refer allegations of any wrongdoing made against an IG or designated staff members. Recently, however, the Subcommittee on Government Operations, which I chair and Mr. Heiss is the ranking member, held a hearing that drew attention to instances when the Integrity Committee itself had fallen short of meeting the standards of transparency expected in its reporting to Congress. H.R. 2681 would help ensure that those who oversee our federal watchdogs are held to the same standards as those they oversee by codifying and enhancing CIGI's own administrative reporting reforms. Specifically, it amends the IG Act of '78 to make the Integrity Committee's periodic reporting to Congress semi-annual. If the Integrity Committee becomes aware of any particularly serious or flagrant problems, abuses, or deficiencies in an IG's office between semi-annual reports, the bill requires that the Integrity Committee chairperson report those issues immediately to the relevant IG office, and the IG would then be required to transmit that report to Congress within 7 days. The bill also requires the Integrity Committee to report the length of time it spends on evaluating allegations when requesting extensions for investigations, information regarding how it evaluates allegations made by a member of Congress, if the review is closed without referral, and an analysis of allegations filed against IG officers and employees. Finally, the bill expands the membership of the Integrity Committee to include at least one former IG. The bill was developed in coordination with CIGI and is endorsed by the Project on Government Oversight. It is bipartisan, and as I said, I'm very pleased to have Mr. Heiss as an original co-sponsor of this good government provision. I urge its adoption.
If the gentleman yields back, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to speak on your amendment. On the bill. It's the bill. Mr. Heiss. I don't think he wants to speak.
Madam Chair?
Yes, You're now recognized.
Am I recognized?
Yes, you are recognized. You are recognized.
Rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse and misconduct is one of the most important jobs of this committee, and the inspectors general serve as the front line to investigate these type of allegations. The Council of Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency is an independent entity established in 2008 to help inspector generals and individual agencies train and create policies to develop a strong workforce. The Integrity Committee is a committee within this council that investigates allegations of wrongdoing made against inspector generals. They ensure robust oversight over inspectors general, holding them to the highest standards of behavior. However, the Integrity Committee's activities have long been a very obscure process, particularly for this Oversight Committee and our leadership, who's entrusted with oversight over the federal agency inspector general and are concerned with any potential wrongdoing. The Integrity Committee has a history of limiting the transparency of their investigations into various allegations of wrongdoing, resulting in confusion and concerns about the legitimacy of some investigations. This legislation dramatically improves the transparency of the Integrity Committee's process and the Oversight Committee's oversight of their operations. For example, the bill requires the Integrity Committee to provide additional information to the Council of Inspector Generals on integrity and efficiency when requesting an extension of time to evaluate an allegation of wrongdoing. It also requires information be provided to Congressional Committee leadership when it closes an allegation from a member of Congress without referral to the Council for investigation. Under the bill, allegations of wrongdoing against inspectors general must be referred to the Integrity Committee to prevent them from stonewalling investigations. This bill brings necessary resources to the Integrity Committee with the addition of an experienced inspector general to assist with their work. And finally, the bill changes the council's annual report to congressional committees to every 6 months with additional reporting requirements regarding the Integrity Committee's activities so that we can stay informed in Congress and better do our job in oversight. So thank you, Chairwoman, and I urge support of this, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself. H.R. 2681, the Integrity Committee Transparency Act, is an important bill introduced by Subcommittee Chairman Connolly with support from Subcommittee Ranking Member Heiss, myself, and several other committee members. The Council of Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency, or CIGI, is composed of IGs from more than 70 federal agencies. The Integrity Committee is responsible for investigating complaints against Inspector Generals and senior OIG officials. In short, the Integrity Committee holds our government watchdogs accountable. This good government bill would make the decision-making process of the Integrity Committee more transparent to the Congress and to the American people. It would also increase confidence that IGs are conducting investigations properly. I am pleased to co-sponsor this legislation. I urge the committee to report it favorably, and I yield back. And who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 2681 is amended favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably to the House. I believe this is the last amendment, H.R. 978, Kai Suda Manat, Remembrance Act from Mr. Connolly. I now call up H.R. 978, Remembrance Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 978 to require the head of each agency to establish a safety plan relating to COVID-19 for any work site at which employees or contractors are required to be physically present.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 978, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you for bringing H.R. 978, the Chai Sutamanant Remembrance Act, back to market. This is the second time this committee has reviewed and marked up and approved this bill. a bill that was also approved on the floor of the House in the previous Congress. For me, this is a very somber commitment to a constituent who died needlessly at the beginning of the pandemic. On May 26 of last year, Chai Sudamamont, a kitchen staff worker at a child care facility at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia, my constituent, a proud immigrant from Thailand, died from coronavirus-related complications, a virus he contracted at work, serving the children of our Marines. He was a loving father and husband. He was known for his kindness and patience and creativity. He had a unique handshake he shared with many of the kids at the child care facility where he worked. His death was a tragedy felt by all too many. Confusion and uncertainty emerged as two of the largest contributing factors to Chai's death. Uncertainty on best practices at the time and agency policies, and a general lack of communication with federal workforce staff led to his death. During a hearing on the Subcommittee of Government Operations, we discussed how clear guidance in COVID-19 return to office protocols is essential to protect our dedicated federal workforce as we figure out what a new normal might look like. We must place protection of the health and safety of federal employees at the forefront, while continuing government operations and providing vital resources to the public. Such protections should reflect the best available guidance to maintain a safe working environment for all employees, but not all agencies have heeded such guidance to date. Just yesterday, the Office of Personnel Management, Office of the Inspector General reported that despite Centers for Disease Control guidance supporting the use of coverings, face coverings, to prevent the spread of COVID-19, OPM did not require such masks in OPM facilities until after President Biden was inaugurated. That kind of lack of guidance, in my opinion, cost my constituent his life. In conjunction with the Biden administration's efforts to advocate for safe workplaces, we have an opportunity as a committee to ensure that these employees have the most accurate and up-to-date information regarding safety plans for federal work sites. H.R. 978, a bill we've approved in the past, would require each agency to prepare and communicate a safety plan for returning workers to physical work sites. The plan would include descriptions of the personal protective equipment that the agency will provide to its on-site employees and contractors, guidance of other mitigation efforts, protections of employees whose work requires them to travel off-site, testing, contact tracing if necessary, and vaccination protocols, protocols that ensure the continuity of operations in the event it's necessary to reverse on-site requirements. The bill also requires each agency's Office of the Inspector General to report on whether the agency has published and implemented its safety plan, review it. As I said, a similar version of this bill, very similar, passed the House last Congress under suspension. This bill is endorsed by the American Federation of Government Employees, the National Treasury Employees Union, the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers, the National Federation of Federal Employees, the National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association, the Professional Managers Association, the Senior Executives Association, and many other organizations. We can take simple steps to protect the health and safety of our exceptional federal employees. They are our government's greatest asset. We must work to prevent any unnecessary illnesses or, tragically, deaths among those who serve our nation so well. I want to say on behalf of Chai's widow, action by this committee today will save lives and will go a long way to helping her family come to some closure in their grief at this terrible loss for them, my community, and Quantico Marine Base. I urge adoption of this bill.
Now recognize myself. H.R. 978 would require federal agencies to establish protocols and protections to ensure the health and safety of federal employees upon returning to their regular workstations. Each agency would be responsible for posting its policy on its website and properly notifying employees of the procedures within 60 days of enactment or 30 days before a closed work site reopens. Within 6 months, the IG of each agency must submit to Congress a review on implementation and communication of the procedures. I am proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill that bears the name of one of Congressman Connolly's constituents, a federal employee who died tragically of coronavirus a year ago. Many federal employees have been on the front lines of the government response to the coronavirus pandemic from the beginning. As more are preparing to return to their regular work sites, this legislation will help make sure that policies are clear and understood so that return happens safely. I'm pleased to support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, you're now recognized.
Thank you. First, let me express my deepest condolences to the family of Mr. Sudamanant. This global pandemic has brought painful loss to many Americans. I want to say to my colleague, Mr. Connolly, that your work on this bill is a very real and stark reminder as to how precious life is and how every loss has long and lasting impacts to family members and the broader community. Over the past year, our nation has faced extraordinary challenges stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the pandemic has presented unprecedented workforce challenges for the federal government. Never before has every single state and territory been under an emergency declaration seeking assistance from federal agencies. But America's government stepped up to the plate. Federal agencies worked around the clock to ensure that states, localities, and hospitals had access to the resources they needed to save lives. Thanks to former President Trump's leadership, the federal government continued to operate in as safe way as possible throughout the pandemic. Both the Trump and Biden administrations have issued numerous guidance materials to federal agencies to ensure that the vital work of American government could continue in a safe manner. This bill is very well intentioned, and I support government-wide transparency to the American people. But the reality is the bill is creating unnecessary and duplicative paperwork. Both the Trump and Biden administrations publicly released much of the information this bill seeks to obtain. The Biden administration is already requiring the current planning the bill seeks. Further, putting restrictive reporting requirements on agencies may hinder the new administration's flexible response to COVID-19 and create unintended consequences. Madam Chair, I do not intend to request a roll call vote on this bill, but I am concerned that it may be duplicating existing efforts of the federal government. I yield back.
Question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those say opposed, say no. Wait a minute. Does someone seek recognition?
Yes, Madam Chair, this is Representative Heiss. I have an amendment.
Okay, Mr. Heiss, you're now recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me just say before I speak to my amendment, this is what we've done today. I just want to say congratulations and thanks to you and members on both sides of the aisle. We've been able to work on several pieces of legislation together, and I personally want to extend thank you to Mr. Connolly. It's been an honor to work with him and his office, specifically on the Integrity Committee Transparency Act, and I just wanted to publicly say that. I was tied up with technical difficulties, as you well noticed a while ago, and I just wanted to publicly give a thanks to him and his work for that. But at the outset here, I also want to join the ranking member in stating that we send our condolences sincerely to the family of Mr. Sudamanant, and along those same lines, those same condolences sincerely go out to Mr. Connolly for the loss of a friend and a constituent, and thank him for his work on this. And I do honestly appreciate the objectives of this bill. The federal workplace needs to be safe for federal employees. We all unite together in that understanding. But at this stage, frankly, thanks to President Obama or President Trump and the Operation Warp Speed, we now have vaccines all over the place, and they're readily accessible to everyone. And so as Americans return to in-person work, I think federal employees should also return to work, and they should at the same time be leading our country out of the pandemic and not lagging behind the rest of society as others are opening up. So my amendment would require agencies in their reopening plans to make clear that the goal of the plan is to return to 100% in-person work within 60 days of enactment of this. And to me, that makes sense. It's what's in the best interest of America and the Americans' people. The mass exodus out of federal offices was supposed to be temporary. It was an emergency measure. It was never intended to be permanent. And of course, now we even see, I have here, and I'm sure we've all seen and heard that DC itself is lifting many of the COVID restrictions on May 21st and plan to fully reopen in June. I think that's great news. And I applaud the leadership of DC for making those decisions. And again, I think that we as the federal government ought to join in that effort and reopen within 60 days of enactment of this. If the current administration wants to look at permanent expanded use of remote work environments, I get it. And we need to have that debate. We need to have that discussion in a thorough manner. The first question is, however, what have been the impacts to service ever since the federal workers have gone remote? No question that service has been impacted. All of us have caseworkers who make an incredible effort to help our constituents deal with the federal government. But my staff certainly tells me that the response rate of some of the federal agencies right now has been slowed dramatically over the past year. And how much of that, I think, is a fair question, is the result of folks simply not being in the office. Furthermore, how would the federal government's office space needs change? It's another question that we need to deal with. Do some of the locality pay policies still make sense? These are very real and I believe very fair questions. But again, as federal employees are able to go back to work, they should go back to work. And so I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I don't think you called up the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 978, offered by Mr. Heiss of Georgia.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman has explained his amendment. Does anyone else wish to speak on it? Mr. Connolly, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I thank my colleague, Mr. Heiss, for the sympathetic remarks he shared with me about the loss of my constituent, and I certainly will pass on those sentiments to his widow and his children. The language being offered by Mr. Heiss, however, as an amendment, would actually be a sweeping departure for the United States Congress in substituting itself for medical expertise and scientific expertise rather than the CDC. For example, on page 2 of his amendment, he says, through vaccinations and mitigation measures.
Hey, I got a question for you.
For those unvaccinated, it is safe for employees to return to full-time in-person work across the country. Who says? That's not CDC finding. That's not Dr. Fauci's finding. I mean, That's just a ex cathedra assertion by Congress if we adopt this language. And in my view, clearly not the intention, but it runs exactly counter to what I'm trying to do with this bill, which is to protect lives, not put them at risk. It was because somebody didn't pay attention to mitigation measures and protective measures that my constituent died in Quantico. He was exposed. He wasn't given protective equipment. He wasn't given a mask or gloves. He wasn't told to safely distance. He was required to come in and wanted to because he didn't know what the danger was. We now do. To assert, based on nothing, that through mitigation measures and vaccinations, the unvaccinated are 100% secure to return to work is false, and Congress has no business asserting it. And the second part of this amendment that is troubling is Section A that says a statement of agency policy that the goal of the plan is to return 100% of the employees of the agency to full-time in-person employment not later than 60 days after the date of enactment of this act. Now, Madam Chairwoman, I represent a lot of companies in my district. I don't know of any large employer who has arbitrarily decided everyone's coming back to work within 60 days. In fact, all the responsible major employers in my district, and I'm talking about employers who employ tens of thousands of employees, are very carefully putting themselves on a graded schedule. 10% can return to work by June 1, maybe 25% by the 4th of July, and we'll look at 50% by September. None of them have said everyone comes back to work in 60 days, not one. But apparently in this language, we're going to require the federal government to do that. And by the way, federal contractors, putting potentially millions of people at risk. Again, not the intent, but the consequence. And again, we're substituting ourselves for CDC. And final point, that language also, again, I don't believe it's intended, could clearly be construed as eliminating telework, because it says 100% of the employees of the agency to full-time in-person employment. That's the language. Well, we want telework with or without a pandemic. This committee has been promoting telework for years, and this language would undo that. I would be glad to yield. So I oppose the amendment. I know my friend wants to get us back to business, and so do I, but I want to do it safely. And my constituents' death is witness to the fact that when we don't, we put people at risk. And my bill is designed to try to avoid that and put in place a simple certification process to try to ensure that when we do ask people to come back to work, they won't be at that kind of lethal risk. I yield to my friend.
Thank you, and I thank my friend for yielding. And again, I think we're similarly barking up similar trees. We want to get back to work, and we both agree on that. And by the way, the CDC has come out to say that people who have been vaccinated are clear not to wear masks even indoors. And what's the point of a vaccine if it is not protection enough to go back to work? That's kind of the point of the vaccine. So that
if I can just reclaim my time there for a second, that's true. But what isn't true is what you say in this language, that the unvaccinated are safe, given the combination of those exposed to the virus or who had it and those who are vaccinated. That is not what the CDC has said. I would yield to my colleague again.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the greater point that what I'm trying to get to is that we need some sort of date. Let's shoot for something to be back to work. All of our constituents, yours as well as mine, I'm sure, have had enormous contact from constituents who cannot get responses from federal agents. And we have virtually all across this country, businesses are open now. States, or Georgia has been open for over a year, and we're moving on, and things are fine. And and the rates of COVID are going down. We can do this. My issue is that let's at least, whether it's 60 days, okay, if there's room to talk on that, but let's have a target of when to go back to work, not just a little bit here and a little bit there. And this thing may take another year or 2 years to roll out. For crying out loud, we have vaccines available for everyone. Let's get the ball rolling and get our country back to work and get the economy back. And with that, I just thank the gentleman for yielding to me.
Absolutely.
I do think we're on the same direction. I just hope that we can land a little bit more specifically in accomplishing what we're both wanting to accomplish. And with that, I yield back.
I certainly understand my friend to be sincere, and I think we all are impatient about wanting to return to some normality. But I think perhaps respectfully, my friend misses the point of this bill. This bill says, before we start to talk about everybody coming back to work, we need a plan. We need to make sure there's a plan that's reviewed that provides comfort to people that they will be safe. That's what this bill does, and it's based on the fact that somebody was not and died. And that somebody was my constituent and a federal employee. And that's what this bill attempts to do. I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Clyde, you are now recognized. Mr. Clyde.
Madam, I don't need to be recognized.
Okay. Mr. Keller, are you seeking to be recognized, Mr. Keller?
No, I yield back.
Okay. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant
I thought Comer said we weren't going to.
Madam Chair, can I ask what the delay is for?
Okay. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume?
Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Acacia-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib? Ms. Porter? Ms. Bush? Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Sarbanes? Ms. Spear?
Spear votes no.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes no.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence? Mr.
Lawrence
Desagne?
vote no. Lawrence votes no.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley? Mr. Quigley? Mr. Comer?
Comer votes yes.
Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Gosar?
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes aye. Ms. Foxx? Ms. Foxx votes aye. Mr. Heiss?
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Cloud?
Yes. Did you get that?
Mr. Cloud votes aye. Mr. Gibbs?
Yes.
Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller?
Keller votes yes.
Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Clyde? Mr. Franklin?
Yes.
Yes. Votes yes. Need time to vote, ma'am.
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes aye. Ms. Mace?
Aye.
Ms. Mace votes aye. Mr. Franklin?
Franklin votes aye.
Mr. Franklin votes aye. Mr. LaTurner? Mr. Fallon? Ms. Harrell? Mr. Donalds? Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Krishnamurthy? Mr. Raskin?
Last vote here.
Mr. Khanna? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Madam Chair, haven't we already gone through the roll?
How is Talib recorded?
Ms. Talib, you are not recorded.
Thank you.
We're
Can
going
you please
through the
record
people
me
who
as a
have not
no?
Voted.
How is Mr. Welch recorded?
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms.
Can we
Porter?
please allow the clerk to go through the roll with no interruptions?
Ms. Porter? Ms. Bush? Mr. Davis?
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes no.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson?
Johnson of Georgia votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes.
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
DeSaulnier, no.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Ms. Presley.
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Quigley.
Quigley votes no.
Mr. Quigley votes no.
Yes, no.
Mr. Jordan.
All right, just.
Mr. Grothman. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Norman.
Higgins votes yes. Higgins is yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman.
Mr. Norman votes yes.
Mr. Norman votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. LaTurner. Mr. Fallon.
Allen votes aye.
Mr. Fallon votes aye. Ms. Harrell. Mr. Donalds. Chairwoman Maloney.
Madam Chair, could I just inquire, has Ms. Porter of California been recorded?
How am I recorded? This is Miss Porter.
Ms. Porter is not recorded.
I vote no.
Ms. Porter
Madam
votes
Chair,
no.
how am I recorded? It's Raskin.
Mr. Raskin is recorded as no.
Thank you.
Davis, how am I recorded?
How is Mr. Lynch recorded?
Mr. Lynch is not recorded.
Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Hi, this is Krishnamurthy. How is he recorded? I gotta make sure they don't still need me.
Mr. Krishnamurthy, you are not recorded.
I'm a no.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no.
Davis, am I recorded?
Mr. Davis is not recorded.
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? And I have not recorded. I vote no.
Ms. Maloney votes no.
And Ms. Tlaib, has she voted?
Yes, Ms. Tlaib is recorded as no.
Okay. Okay, the clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Madam Chair, this is Hank Johnson from Georgia, and we talk slow down here, but I'm in Washington, D.C., so I'll try to speed it up a little bit. How am I recorded?
Mr. Johnson, you are recorded as no.
Thank you.
Okay, the clerk will report the tally when ready.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Ms. Norton is not, are you recorded? Is Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton is recorded as no.
Okay, you're no. Okay, the clerk will report the tally. The clerk will report the tally.
How is Ms. Bush? I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
Move to previous question.
Who's speaking? Ms. Bush, how is Ms. Bush recorded?
Ms. Bush is not recorded.
Ms. Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush is a no.
Ms. Bush votes no.
Now the clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, we have 22 ayes and 13 nays.
Other way around.
Sorry. 13 ayes, 22 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those
Aye.
opposed say no. In the
No.
opinion of the chair?
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment to the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 978 as amended favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably to the House. And before I close, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Comer for any closing remarks he may have.
Madam Chair, I just simply want to say I think it's a good day for the Oversight Committee that we were able to come together in a bipartisan way on a major piece of legislation. We have broad jurisdiction in this committee over a lot of oversight, just about every possible facet of oversight in the federal government, and that's a huge responsibility. But from a policy standpoint, we're pretty limited as to what this committee has primary jurisdiction over. The Postal Service is one of those areas. I don't think there's any question to most Americans that the Postal Service is underperforming and hemorrhaging money, and I think that it's a good day for the future of this committee that we can come together and pass a bipartisan piece of legislation on a government service that has to be reformed. And we're happy that there's going to be reforms in the Postal Service. We're happy that DeJoy has produced a plan because his predecessor sure did not. And I think that this will serve us well into the future. We're not going to agree on a whole lot in this committee when we get into a lot of different debates, especially on some of the committee topics that we've had here lately. But I think it's a good day for this committee that we can come together and not just the Postal Service, but some good government bills with Mr. Connolly and Mr. Heiss as well. So with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
I want to thank all of the members for a really productive, largely bipartisan markup, particularly Ranking Member Comer. I truly believe the best legislation is always bipartisan, and we have accomplished something today that's very important. Not only have we moved critical legislation to help the post office fix its financial situation and stay operating for years into the future, but we've moved forward on legislation to make the government more accountable and transparent. We've also approved legislation to ensure Postal Service employees have the same paid family leave benefits as other public servants. It makes it easier for the Postal Service to support election officials and help federal elections run more smoothly with the barcode bill. Most importantly, we have had strong bipartisan support on most of the bills we had before us today. While we cannot always agree and have not always agreed on everything, this markup shows that there are things that we can work together on to help better serve the American people and our country. There is still much more work to be done, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to get to the finish line on these important measures. This was a difficult bill to negotiate and to pass. I want to thank the union leadership that has a stake in the post office, the NALC President Rolando, APWU President Diamondstein, NPMHU President Hogrogan, and NRLCA President Stutz for their support, long work and dedication, and partnership on moving this bill forward. Also, I want to thank Ranking Member Comer again for his dedicated leadership, and Representatives Connolly, Lynch, and Lawrence and their staffs for their efforts through a very difficult and situation. I've passed a lot of bills in my life. This was the hardest, I will say that. So I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of everyone that was part of it. I particularly thank the staff on both sides of the aisle and the legislative director, and particularly Mark Stevenson, for all of their efforts. And I just want to thank everyone that's been part of this effort. I think we accomplished something very important for the country. It's really important to save the post office, and I think we've been a big part of saving it and making it stronger going into the future. With that, there is no further business of the committee, so I want to thank you all for your participation today, and the committee stands adjourned.